The grand concert hall in Boston shimmered under soft golden lights. Outside, a light autumn rain tapped against the tall windows, but inside, the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. Tonight was the annual Young Pianist Competition, one of the most prestigious events for young musicians across the country. Professor Eleanor Wright adjusted her glasses and smoothed her dark blue blazer as she settled into her seat in the front row. The judges' table gave her a perfect view of the gleaming black grand piano that waited center stage. She had been judging this competition for 15 years now, and teaching piano at the New England Conservatory for 30. Very little surprised her anymore. "They say we have 26 contestants this year," said Richard, the head judge, as he organized his scoring sheets. "Should be wrapped up by 9 if we're lucky." Eleanor nodded, already flipping through the program booklet. "Any standouts from the preliminary rounds?" "The usual suspects from Juilliard's pre-college program. And there's a girl from Chicago who's quite remarkable." Richard lowered his voice, "Though I'm not sure why they included the boy from Nebraska. Apparently he's mostly self-taught." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Self-taught? In this competition?" She couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. The annual Young Pianist Competition wasn't for hobbyists or beginners. Most participants had been training intensively since they were 4 or 5 years old. The lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of the event. The audience, mostly parents, teachers, and classical music enthusiasts, quieted down as the host walked onto the stage. After a brief welcome speech explaining the rules and introducing the judges, the competition began. The first 3 performers were exactly what Eleanor expected, technically proficient children from well-known music schools, playing pieces by Chopin and Beethoven with competence if not particular creativity. She gave them fair scores, adding detailed notes about finger technique and emotional expression. "Next, we have Chen Li, age 12, from Millfield, Nebraska," announced the host. Eleanor glanced down at her program. Chen Li would be playing Bach's Goldberg Variations, an ambitious choice especially for someone his age. The piece required not just technical skill, but a maturity of interpretation that most young pianists simply didn't possess. She prepared herself for what would likely be an overreaching performance. When Chen walked onto the stage, Eleanor's expectations dropped even further. He was small for his age, with a mop of black hair that needed a trim. His dark suit was slightly too large for his frame, and he walked with the stiff nervousness of someone unaccustomed to being on stage. Several audience members exchanged glances. This didn't look promising. Chen bowed awkwardly to the audience and then to the judges. Eleanor offered a polite smile, the kind she'd perfected over years of teaching, encouraging but not overly warm. She watched as he approached the piano, his shoes making soft sounds against the wooden floor. "Poor kid," whispered Diane, the judge to her right. "Bach is going to eat him alive." Eleanor said nothing, but privately agreed. The Goldberg Variations were challenging even for accomplished adult pianists. She picked up her pen, prepared to document what would likely be a learning experience for the young performer. Chen climbed onto the bench and had to adjust it higher to reach the keys properly. His feet barely reached the pedals. The hall was completely silent now, that peculiar silence that always contained a hint of anticipation and, in this case, a touch of collective worry for the small boy facing such a monumental task. He took a deep breath, placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The opening aria of the Goldberg Variations filled the hall. Chen's first notes were tentative, slightly too measured, revealing his nervousness. Eleanor made a quick note about his rigid posture and inconsistent tempo. The audience remained politely attentive, though several people shifted in their seats. "Rushing the middle section," Eleanor wrote on her notepad, underlining the words. She had heard countless students make the same mistake, speeding up when the piece required patience. 5 minutes in, Chen's playing was adequate, but uninspiring. Eleanor found her mind wandering to her evening plans. She had papers to grade and emails to answer. She forced her attention back to the performance, reminding herself that every young musician deserved her full consideration. Something changed around the 7th minute. Chen's back straightened almost imperceptibly, and his approach to the keyboard shifted. The notes became clearer, more purposeful. Eleanor paused her writing, listening more carefully. By the 10th minute, she had stopped taking notes entirely. Chen's small hands were now moving with surprising confidence and precision. His interpretation of the piece was becoming something unexpected, not just technically correct, but thoughtful. Where most young pianists played Bach with mechanical precision, Chen was finding the humanity in the mathematics of the composition. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her critical ear catching something unusual in his approach to the counter melodies. He wasn't playing it like a student who had memorized the notes. He was playing it like someone who understood the architecture of the piece. Richard, who had been checking his phone between performances, now placed it face down on the table and focused entirely on the boy at the piano. Diane had stopped writing as well. In the audience, a similar transformation was taking place. The polite attention had deepened into genuine interest. Parents who had been discreetly checking their watches were now watching the stage. A woman in the third row slowly lowered her program booklet. A man near the back straightened in his seat. As Chen approached one of the most technically challenging variations, Eleanor held her breath without realizing it. This was where most performers his age would simplify or stumble. But Chen's fingers danced across the keys with remarkable dexterity, finding each note with precision that belied his years. Where did he learn to play like that? Diane whispered, voicing the question forming in Eleanor's mind. Nebraska wasn't known for its classical piano education. The program said he studied with a local teacher named Mrs. Huang, someone Eleanor had never heard of. Yet here was this boy playing Bach with a clarity and depth that many of her conservatory students couldn't achieve. Eleanor felt a familiar, but nearly forgotten sensation, the quiet thrill of discovering genuine talent in an unexpected place. It had been years since a performance had truly surprised her. As a teacher and judge, she had developed an almost automatic ability to categorize young pianists within their first few minutes at the keyboard. Chen had just broken through those categories. The light caught his face as he played, revealing an expression of complete concentration. There was no showmanship, no dramatic gestures or unnecessary movements that many young performers adopted to appear more impressive. Just a boy and the music connected in that rare, pure way that couldn't be manufactured or forced. As Chen moved deeper into the variations, the story Bach was telling through his composition began to emerge with surprising clarity. Eleanor felt a slight flush of embarrassment at her earlier dismissal. She had judged him before he played a single note, based on his appearance, his background, his age. The hall had fallen into that special kind of silence that comes only with collective engagement. Not the silence of politeness, but the silence of attention. Even the usual subtle sounds of an audience, the shifting, the quiet coughs, the program pages turning, had faded away. There was only Bach's intricate musical architecture, brought to life by the most unlikely interpreter. Eleanor glanced at the audience and saw the same wonder reflected on dozens of faces. Parents were sitting perfectly still. Other young competitors watched with expressions ranging from surprise to admiration, to the first dawning of competitive concern. One of the stage lights caught Chen's hands, casting a slight shadow on the keyboard. His fingers seemed to almost hover above the keys before each note, like a hummingbird pausing momentarily before diving for nectar. It was an unusual technique, not one taught in any of the major schools, yet it was producing a tone quality that was distinct and beautiful. Eleanor found herself wondering about this boy's story. How had he found his way to Bach? Who had first recognized his gift? What was it like for him in Millfield, Nebraska, carrying this extraordinary ability? The questions piled up in her mind as the music continued to fill the hall. As Chen approached the final section of the piece, Eleanor realized she hadn't written a single note in over 15 minutes. Her score sheet remained half empty, her pen forgotten in her hand. She would have to reconstruct her technical assessment from memory later, something she never had to do. She had always been able to listen critically while documenting her observations. But right now, she was simply listening. Not as Professor Eleanor Wright of the New England Conservatory, not as a competition judge with decades of experience, but as someone witnessing something rare and genuine. A perfect meeting between a timeless piece of music and a performer who, despite all odds, understood it completely. The young pianist was no longer the awkward boy in the too large suit who had walked nervously onto the stage. He had transformed, not physically, but in that indefinable way that happens when genuine artists connect fully with their art. The performance was approaching its conclusion, but Eleanor already knew that something extraordinary had happened in this hall tonight. And judging by the rapt expressions around her, she wasn't the only one who knew it. As Chen moved deeper into Bach's Goldberg variations, the concert hall seemed to grow smaller and more intimate. The rain outside had picked up, its gentle patter against the windows creating a natural backdrop to the music flowing from the grand piano. Yet inside, time had slowed down for everyone listening. Eleanor found herself leaning forward in her chair, her eyes fixed on Chen's hands. His fingers moved with a confidence that contradicted his earlier nervousness. Each note rang clear and purposeful in the hushed space. "Variation 15, whispered Richard, the head judge. "This is where most students falter." Eleanor nodded slightly, not taking her eyes off the young performer. Variation 15 was indeed one of the most challenging sections of Bach's masterpiece. A canon played in contrary motion that required both technical precision and emotional restraint. Many experienced pianists struggled to find the right balance. Chen took a barely perceptible breath before beginning the variation. His left hand established the haunting minor key pattern, while his right hand created the counter melody. The effect was like watching two separate stories unfold simultaneously, somehow connected yet distinct. In the audience, a woman closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. An older man who had been checking his watch every few minutes now sat completely still. Even the usual shuffling and quiet coughing had ceased. The hall had fallen into that rare, perfect silence that comes when an audience is truly captivated. Eleanor glanced down at her notepad, realizing she had written nothing for nearly 10 minutes. This never happened to her. She always maintained her professional distance, her critical ear. But there was something about Chen's playing that made her want to simply listen. His small hands stretched to reach difficult chords, yet there was no strain in his playing. His technique wasn't flashy or dramatic. There were no exaggerated movements or facial expressions that young performers often adopted to appear more passionate. Instead, there was just the music flowing through him like a clear stream. "Where did he learn to play like this?" Diane whispered again, echoing the question that was on Eleanor's mind. According to his brief biography in the program, Chen had started piano lessons just 4 years ago with Mrs. Huang, the only piano teacher in Millfield, Nebraska. Mrs. Huang herself had studied at a small state college, not one of the prestigious conservatories. By all conventional wisdom, Chen shouldn't be playing at this level. As the young pianist transitioned into the next variation, his body relaxed slightly. A subtle change came over his face, the intense concentration giving way to something else, something Eleanor recognized from her own performing days. It was that rare moment when technical mastery became so complete that the performer could simply inhabit the music, letting it breathe through them. Eleanor had seen this happen with advanced conservatory students, sometimes with particularly gifted undergraduates, but she had never seen it in a 12-year-old, especially one without access to elite training. In the third row, a tall man with gray hair who Eleanor recognized as a music critic for the Boston Globe had taken out a small notebook. He was writing quickly, glancing up frequently at the stage. Nearby, the piano teacher from Juilliard's pre-college division was watching with unconcealed amazement. Chen approached Variation 22, one of Bach's light-hearted, almost playful sections. Here, his youth seemed to become an advantage rather than a limitation. Where older performers might overthink this part, Chen captured its simple joy perfectly. The corner of his mouth turned up in a slight unconscious smile as his fingers danced across the keys. The audience responded to this subtle shift, a collective warmth spreading through the hall. Even Eleanor felt herself smiling. There was something contagious about the pure, unaffected enjoyment radiating from the boy at the piano. "He's playing it like he's telling a story," Richard murmured, sounding surprised. That was exactly it, Eleanor realized. Chen wasn't just playing notes on a page. He was communicating, speaking through Bach's language as naturally as if it were his own. Many students his age approached Bach with technical correctness, but missed the humanity in the mathematics. Chen had somehow found it. The light caught his profile as he played. Despite his formal suit, he looked like any ordinary 12-year-old boy. His hair fell slightly over his forehead, and his cheek still held the roundness of childhood. Yet his hands moved with the authority of someone who had been playing for decades. Eleanor thought about her own students at the conservatory. Many of them were technically brilliant, the products of intensive training and countless hours of practice. They could execute difficult passages flawlessly, hit every note with precision, but how many of them played with this kind of natural musicality, this intuitive understanding? As Chen moved into the 25th variation, the famous Black Pearl of the Goldberg variations, the hall grew even quieter. This section, with its chromatic harmonies and emotional depth, was often considered the heart of Bach's composition. Many musicians approached it with excessive drama, but Chen played it with simple honesty. The result was somehow more powerful than any showy interpretation. Eleanor noticed a slight tremble in his left hand during a particularly complex passage, a brief reminder that he was, after all, just a boy from a small town facing an enormous challenge. But instead of detracting from the performance, this moment of vulnerability only made it more genuine. Next to her, Diane had stopped writing entirely. Richard was sitting perfectly still, his usual restlessness completely gone. The other judges, too, seemed transfixed. This wasn't the polite attention they usually gave to contestants. This was genuine amazement. In the back of the hall, Eleanor spotted a middle-aged couple holding hands tightly. The woman's eyes glistened with tears. From their anxious expressions and the way they followed every note, they had to be Chen's parents. She tried to imagine what they must be feeling, watching their son on this grand stage, surprising everyone with his unexpected gift. As Chen approached the 30th and final variation, the famous quadlibet, Eleanor realized she was holding her breath. This playful section, where Bach wove together several folk tunes within his complex structure, required a lightness of touch that was difficult to achieve after the emotional intensity of the previous variations. Chen's hands seemed to dance above the keys, finding each note with precision yet making it all seem effortless. There was joy in his playing now, a celebratory quality that perfectly captured Bach's intention. The piece was building toward its conclusion, coming full circle. Around the hall, audience members had shifted forward in their seats. Parents of other contestants watched with expressions ranging from admiration to astonishment. A few of the younger pianists who had already performed exchanged wide-eyed glances. What they were witnessing wasn't just good playing, it was something extraordinary. In the final moments of the piece, as Chen returned to the opening aria, there was a subtle but profound change in his approach. The notes were the same as those he had played 30 minutes earlier, but now they carried the weight of the journey. Each phrase seemed to contain echoes of the variations that had come between, transformed by the experience. Eleanor felt a tightness in her throat. This was what Bach had intended, this sense of return that was both the same and profoundly different. Many pianists missed this essential quality, but Chen had captured it perfectly. As the final notes hung in the air, Chen's hands lifted from the keys with a grace that seemed to extend the music even after the sound had faded. For a moment he sat completely still, as if reluctant to break the spell. The hall remained silent, not the awkward silence of a disappointed audience, but the breathless silence that comes when something genuine and beautiful has touched everyone present. Eleanor could feel the collective heartbeat of the room, the shared experience of something unexpected and precious. Chen lowered his hands to his lap and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of completion. Then slowly he stood and turned to face the audience. His expression was a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and quiet satisfaction. For 3 endless seconds the silence held. Then, like a dam breaking, the applause began. It started in the back of the hall, a few quick claps that rapidly spread across the rows, building into a thunderous response. People rose to their feet, first a few, then dozens, then the entire audience. The applause grew louder, punctuated by shouts of "Bravo!" and "Magnificent!" Eleanor found herself standing too, though she couldn't remember deciding to rise. Her notepad lay forgotten on the table. Next to her, all the other judges were on their feet. Richard was clapping with uncharacteristic enthusiasm, a broad smile on his usually serious face. On stage, Chen looked startled by the response. He blinked rapidly as if coming out of a dream. A flush spread across his cheeks as he took in the standing ovation. He bowed awkwardly, clearly unprepared for this level of appreciation. Eleanor watched him, her heart full of a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, the pure joy of discovering genuine, unexpected talent. In that moment, all her preconceptions and assumptions fell away. She had been utterly and completely wrong about Chen Li from Millfield, Nebraska, and she had never been happier to be wrong. The applause continued to roll through the concert hall like thunder. Chen stood on stage, his eyes wide with surprise at the reaction his playing had received. He bowed again, this time a little deeper, his small frame nearly disappearing behind the grand piano. Eleanor found herself clapping harder than she had in years. There was something liberating about this moment, about being so completely surprised by a performance that all her carefully constructed professional distance had crumbled away. Around her, the other judges were equally moved. Richard, who rarely showed emotion, was smiling broadly. Diane had tears in her eyes. "Extraordinary," Richard said, leaning toward Eleanor. "Absolutely extraordinary." Chen bowed one final time before walking off the stage. His steps were steadier now, more confident than when he had first appeared. The applause followed him, not diminishing even after he disappeared into the wings. The host of the competition hurried onto the stage, looking slightly flustered. This level of response was clearly not what he had expected for the middle of the preliminary round. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his hands to quiet the audience, "we will take a 15-minute intermission before continuing with the remaining contestants." People began to stand, stretching and turning to one another, eager to discuss what they had just witnessed. The buzz of conversation filled the hall, punctuated by phrases like "incredible technique" and "never heard anything like it." Eleanor turned to her fellow judges. "I need to speak with him. This was unusual. Judges typically didn't interact with contestants until after the entire competition was over, but Richard nodded in understanding. "Go ahead. I think we could all use a moment to process what we just heard anyway." Eleanor gathered her notes and made her way backstage. The area behind the curtain was a maze of narrow hallways and small rooms where contestants waited their turn. She asked a stagehand where she might find Chen Li. "The kid from Nebraska. Practice room 3 down the hall to your left." Eleanor thanked him and walked down the corridor. She could hear muffled piano notes coming from various rooms, other contestants continuing to practice before their performances. From practice room 3, however, there was silence. She knocked gently on the door. "Come in," called a woman's voice. Eleanor opened the door to find a small room with an upright piano in the corner. Chen sat on the piano bench, drinking water from a plastic bottle. Next to him stood a petite woman with graying hair, presumably his mother, and a tall man who had to be his father. They all looked up as she entered. "I'm Professor Eleanor Wright," she said, stepping into the room, one of the judges. "I hope you don't mind my stopping by." Chen's mother looked surprised but quickly recovered. "Of course not. I'm Grace Lee, and this is my husband Tom. And you already know Chen." The boy placed his water bottle on top of the piano and stood up. "Hello, ma'am," he said quietly. Up close, he looked even younger than he had on stage. His dark hair fell across his forehead and his tie was slightly crooked. But his eyes were remarkable, deep and thoughtful, with a stillness that seemed at odds with his youth. "That was a remarkable performance," Eleanor said, looking directly at Chen. "One of the finest interpretations of the Goldberg variations I've heard in this competition. In any competition, actually." Chen looked down, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "Thank you," he said softly. His father placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're very proud of him." There was an awkward pause. Eleanor realized she hadn't fully thought through why she'd come backstage. It wasn't standard procedure, but something about Chen's playing had touched her deeply, had reminded her of why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. "I'm curious," she said finally. "How long have you been playing Bach?" Chen glanced up. 3 years, Mrs. Huang, my teacher, she loves Bach. She gave me the Goldberg variations last summer." "Last summer?" Eleanor couldn't hide her surprise. Most students would need at least 2 years to master a piece of that complexity. Chen nodded. "It took me a while to understand it. Mrs. Huang made me listen to different recordings, Glenn Gould mostly, and we talked about what Bach might have been trying to say." His mother smiled. Chen would play a variation, then they would discuss it like it was a story. What the characters were doing, where they were going. This explained the narrative quality Eleanor had heard in his playing, that sense that he was telling a story through the music rather than simply executing notes on a page. "Mrs. Huang sounds like a wonderful teacher," Eleanor said. The only piano teacher in Millfield, Tom explained. She taught music at the elementary school until she retired. Now she gives private lessons in her living room. Eleanor was fascinated. And how did you start playing, Chen? The boy seemed to relax slightly as the conversation shifted away from praise of his performance. We moved to Millfield when I was 8, he said. Mrs. Huang lives next door to us. She has a baby grand piano that belonged to her mother. I used to hear her playing through the open windows in the summer. His mother took up the story. He would stand in our yard for hours just listening. One day, Mrs. Huang invited him in and let him try the piano. She called us that evening and said Chen had natural talent, that his hands seemed to know what to do without being told. She offered to teach him for free. Tom added, "We couldn't afford lessons otherwise. I work at the grain elevator and Grace cleans houses." Eleanor nodded, understanding more now. This wasn't the typical competition backstory of privilege and intensive training. Chen's journey to this stage had been guided by passion and circumstance. A retired school teacher with a love for Bach, a boy with an innate gift and parents who supported his unusual interest despite limited means. "Does your school have a music program?" Eleanor asked Chen. He shook his head. "No, ma'am. Budget cuts. But sometimes I play for school assemblies." Eleanor tried to imagine this extraordinary young pianist in a small Nebraska town with no music program, no community of fellow musicians, no access to live classical performances. It made his achievement even more remarkable. "What did you think of the piano?" she asked, genuinely curious. "It's a Steinway concert grand. Probably different from what you're used to playing." Chen's eyes lit up. It was amazing. Like it was helping me play. The keys responded so quickly and the sound... He trailed off, seemingly unable to find the words. "It's a far cry from Mrs. Huang's living room," his father said with a small laugh, "or the upright at the Lutheran church where Chen practices when Mrs. Huang has other students." Eleanor felt a lump forming in her throat. She thought of her students at the conservatory, with their access to practice rooms full of quality instruments, to concerts and master classes, to a whole ecosystem designed to nurture their talents. And here was Chen, practicing on whatever piano he could find, guided by a retired school teacher, producing music that had just moved an entire concert hall to tears. A stagehand appeared in the doorway. "Professor Wright? They're asking for you. The intermission is ending." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you. I'll be right there." She turned back to Chen and his parents. "I should get back to my seat. But I wanted to tell you in person how moved I was by your playing." Chen looked up at her, his expression serious. "Do you think I did okay with the tempo in Variation 17? I was worried it might have been too slow." The question caught Eleanor by surprise. After receiving a standing ovation, his concern was with a technical detail that only another musician would have noticed. It spoke volumes about his dedication to the craft. "The tempo was perfect," she said honestly. "You found exactly the right pace to let the music breathe without losing its forward momentum." Relief washed over his face. "Mrs. Huang and I worked on that section for weeks. She always says Bach shouldn't be rushed, that every note needs room to speak." "Mrs. Huang is absolutely right," Eleanor said, smiling. "Bach isn't about speed. It's about clarity and intention." She extended her hand. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Chen. And you too, Mr. and Mrs. Lee." Chen shook her hand solemnly, his small fingers still warm from playing. His parents thanked her for coming backstage, their pride in their son evident in their faces. As Eleanor walked back to the judging table, her mind was spinning. In her 30 years of teaching, she had encountered many talented young pianists. Some had gone on to international careers, performing in the world's greatest concert halls, but few had moved her the way Chen Li had today. She took her seat just as the house lights dimmed for the next performer. The audience had settled down, though there was still an undercurrent of excitement running through the hall. Chen's performance had shifted something in the atmosphere, raised the bar for everyone who would follow. Eleanor opened her notebook to a fresh page, but her thoughts kept returning to Chen and his unlikely journey from a small town in Nebraska to this prestigious stage. She had entered the hall today as a seasoned judge, confident in her ability to assess and categorize young talent. She had left that confidence somewhere in Variation 15 of Chen's performance, and as the next contestant began to play, Eleanor realized that she was listening differently now, with greater openness, less certainty about what excellence might look like or where it might come from. It was an uncomfortable feeling, but also a liberating one. Sometimes the greatest gift was being proven wrong about what you thought you knew for certain. The rest of the competition passed in a blur for Eleanor. She listened to the remaining contestants with professional attention, making detailed notes on their technique, interpretation, and musicality. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Chen's performance. It had awakened something in her, a reminder of why she had devoted her life to music in the first place. By 9:30, all 26 young pianists had performed. The judges retired to a small conference room to deliberate, though there was little doubt in anyone's mind about who would advance to the finals. "I think we can all agree that Chen Li was in a category of his own today," Richard said, shuffling through his scoring sheets. The other judges nodded in agreement. "His Bach was extraordinary," said Philip, the youngest judge on the panel, "but I'm curious to see what he'll do with the romantic repertoire in the finals. Bach suits his thoughtful approach, but Chopin requires a different kind of emotionality." Eleanor considered this. "I think we might be surprised again. There's a depth to his playing that transcends style periods." They spent the next hour selecting the other finalists and preparing their comments. When they returned to the main hall, the audience was waiting expectantly. Parents leaned forward in their seats, eyes anxious. The young pianists sat together in the front rows, some holding hands for support, others sitting perfectly still as if afraid any movement might affect the outcome. The head judge announced the 5 finalists in alphabetical order: Lily Chen from Chicago, Anthony Jackson from New York, Chen Li from Nebraska, David Rosenberg from Boston, and Isabella Torres from Miami. Each name was met with enthusiastic applause, but when Chen's name was called, the hall erupted. Clearly, his performance had left a lasting impression not just on the judges, but on everyone present. The finals would take place tomorrow evening. Each finalist would perform a piece from the Romantic period, followed by a modern composition of their choice. The contrast would test their versatility and emotional range. As the crowd dispersed, Eleanor caught sight of Chen and his parents near the exit. The boy looked tired but happy, his mother's arm around his shoulders. Several people stopped to congratulate him, shaking his hand and patting his back. He accepted their praise with shy nods, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention. Eleanor watched them leave, then gathered her things and headed to her car. The rain had stopped and the night air was cool and clear. Stars peeked out from behind thinning clouds. As she drove home, she found herself humming fragments of the Goldberg variations, the notes still echoing in her mind. The next morning, Eleanor woke early. She had a few hours before she needed to be back at the concert hall for the finals. On impulse, she decided to visit the Boston Conservatory's practice rooms. It was Saturday, so the building would be quieter than usual. But never completely silent. Music students practiced 7 days a week. She nodded to the security guard at the entrance and made her way to the 3rd floor. As expected, the sounds of various instruments filtered through closed doors. A violin working through a difficult passage, a flute playing scales, a cellist deep in the heart of a Bach suite. Eleanor found an empty practice room at the end of the hall. It was small, with just enough space for an upright piano and a chair. She sat down, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. She hadn't practiced regularly in years. Teaching and judging had gradually taken over her musical life, pushing her own playing to the margins. But this morning, she felt drawn to the keyboard. Inspired by the young pianist she had heard yesterday, Eleanor played Bach, not the Goldberg variations, but a simple prelude from the well-tempered clavier. Her fingers were stiff at first, missing the easy fluency they once had, but gradually as she continued, some of the old muscle memory returned. The music began to flow more naturally. She played for almost an hour, losing track of time in that way that only happens when one is fully absorbed in making music. When she finally stopped, her hands were tired, but her mind felt clearer, more centered than it had in months. On her way out, she passed a practice room where a young woman was playing Chopin's Ballade No. 1. Through the small window in the door, Eleanor could see her student May bent over the keyboard in intense concentration. Eleanor paused, listening. May was talented and hardworking, one of her most promising students. But as she listened now, with Chen's playing still fresh in her mind, Eleanor heard something missing in May's interpretation. Not a technical flaw, but an absence of that natural connection to the heart of the music. Eleanor had always taught technique first, believing that emotional depth would follow once the mechanical aspects were mastered. But Chen's playing suggested a different path, one where the connection to the music's essence guided the development of technique, rather than the other way around. She made a mental note to try a new approach with May at their next lesson. Perhaps they could spend less time on technical exercises and more time discussing what Chopin might have been feeling when he wrote the ballade, what stories were embedded in its melodic lines. By early evening, the concert hall was filled to capacity. Word had spread about the remarkable young pianist from Nebraska, and people were eager to hear him perform again. Extra chairs had been brought in to accommodate the overflow crowd. Music students from the local conservatories lined the walls, standing room tickets clutched in their hands. Backstage, Eleanor found the 5 finalists preparing in their individual practice rooms. She peeked into Chen's room and saw him sitting quietly with his eyes closed, his hands resting in his lap. He wasn't practicing frantically like the others. He seemed to be going through the music in his mind. The finals began at 7 o'clock sharp. Each finalist would play 2 pieces. First, their romantic selection, followed by a modern composition. Lily Chen from Chicago went first, playing Chopin's Ballade No. 3 with technical brilliance, though Eleanor found her interpretation somewhat calculated. Anthony Jackson followed with a muscular performance of Liszt's La Campanella, his fingers flying over the keys in the difficult passages. Chen was third. He walked onto the stage with the same unassuming demeanor as the day before, though he seemed slightly more at ease now. He adjusted the bench, took a deep breath, and began to play. His selection was Schumann's Kinderscenen, Scenes from Childhood. Not the flashy, virtuoso piece most competitors would choose, but a set of 13 short, deceptively simple musical vignettes capturing different aspects of childhood. It was an unusual choice for a competition, where technical fireworks typically impressed judges more than subtle storytelling. From the opening notes of Foreign Lands and People, it was clear that Chen had found the perfect vehicle for his natural musicality. Each piece in the cycle came alive under his fingers, the playful energy of Catch Me If You Can, the gentle rocking of Dreaming, the innocent wonder of Curious Story. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. She had heard Kinderscenen hundreds of times before, had taught it to dozens of students. But Chen brought something new to the familiar notes, a genuine childlike perspective that made perfect sense coming from a 12-year-old, yet was informed by a musical understanding far beyond his years. When he reached Träumerei, Dreaming, the most famous section of the work, the hall grew even quieter. Chen played it with such simplicity and directness that it felt less like a performance and more like an intimate confession. The sweet, yearning melody floated above gentle chords, creating a moment of perfect, shared vulnerability. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked around. Throughout the hall, people sat perfectly still, many with their eyes closed. Some had tears streaming down their faces. Even the other judges seemed deeply moved. Richard, usually so composed, was blinking rapidly. Chen finished the cycle with The Poet Speaks, the final reflective piece in Schumann's work. The last chords hung in the air like a question left unanswered. Then, after a moment of complete silence, the audience erupted in applause even more enthusiastic than the day before. People rose to their feet, calling out, "Bravo!" and "Magnificent." A woman in the front row wiped tears from her eyes. 2 elderly men near Eleanor were nodding vigorously, clearly overcome. In the back of the hall, Chen's parents stood hand in hand, their faces shining with pride and wonder. Chen stood and bowed, then sat down again for his second piece. This would be his contemporary selection, a composition written after 1950. Eleanor was intensely curious about what he had chosen. The answer came as Chen placed his hands on the keyboard and played a sparkling, rhythmic figure that immediately identified the piece as China Gates by John Adams, a work from 1977 that used repeating patterns to create shimmering, meditative soundscapes. It was minimalist music, but with rich harmonic movement beneath its seemingly simple surface. Again, it was an unexpected choice for a competition, not a technical showpiece, but a work that required extreme control, sensitivity to subtle shifts in harmony, and the ability to create hypnotic, colorful textures. Chen played it beautifully, his hands moving in constant motion, creating rippling patterns that gradually transformed. Under his touch, the piece became a journey through changing landscapes of sound, each section flowing naturally into the next. His incredible control allowed him to bring out inner voices and harmonic shifts that many pianists missed. Eleanor found herself completely drawn in, the music creating a trance-like state where time seemed to expand and contract. When Chen played the final, gently resolving chords, it felt like waking from a vivid dream. Once again, the audience responded with immediate, heartfelt applause. Chen stood, bowed deeply, and walked off the stage, his small figure disappearing behind the curtain. The remaining two finalists performed admirably, David Rosenberg with a fiery Rachmaninoff and a thorny Prokofiev, Isabella Torres with an expressive Brahms and a rhythmically challenging Ginastera. But the hall had been permanently altered by Chen's playing. Everyone knew they had witnessed something rare and precious. When all 5 finalists had performed, they returned to the stage together, standing in a line as they waited for the judge's decision. The contrast was striking, Chen small and serious next to his taller, more polished competitors. Yet there was a quiet confidence about him now, a sense that he belonged on this stage. Eleanor looked at her fellow judges. There was no need for discussion. They all knew who the winner would be. The 5 finalists stood in a line on stage, the spotlights casting long shadows behind them. Chen looked small next to the others, his borrowed suit still slightly too large for his frame. But he stood tall, his hands clasped in front of him, his face calm. The other young pianists shifted nervously, adjusting their formal clothes, exchanging quick glances. The audience sat in expectant silence. Richard, as head judge, approached the microphone at center stage. He carried a sealed envelope containing the results. Though everyone in the hall, judges, audience members, even the other finalists, seemed to know what it would contain. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice resonating through the hall, "it has been our great privilege to hear these exceptional young musicians over the past 2 days. Each finalist has demonstrated remarkable skill, dedication, and musicality. They should all be incredibly proud." He paused, looking at the 5 young people standing before him. "Before I announce the results, I want to say something a bit unusual. In my 30 years of judging piano competitions, I have learned that music is not truly a competitive sport. We can judge technical proficiency, yes. We can evaluate accuracy and skill. But music at its heart is about communication, about one human soul reaching out to others through the language of sound. And that connection is something beyond competition." The audience was perfectly still, hanging on his words. "That said," Richard continued with a small smile, "we do have awards to give." He opened the envelope. "The 3rd place award goes to Isabella Torres." The audience applauded warmly as Isabella stepped forward, accepted her certificate and the bronze medallion, and returned to her place in line. "The 2nd place award goes to Anthony Jackson." More applause as Anthony received his silver medallion, looking pleased but slightly disappointed. Richard paused, building the moment. "And the 1st place award, which includes a gold medallion, a cash prize of $5,000 and a special performance opportunity with the Boston Symphony Orchestra next season, goes to..." The hall held its collective breath. "Chen Li, from Millfield, Nebraska." The audience erupted. People leapt to their feet, applauding wildly. Several shouted, "Bravo!" A group of music students in the back whistled and cheered. The sound was deafening, waves of appreciation crashing against the stage. Chen stood frozen for a moment, as if unable to believe what he had heard. Then, with a gentle nudge from Lily Chen beside him, he stepped forward. The applause grew even louder. Richard placed the gold medallion around Chen's neck and handed him an elaborate certificate in a blue folder. Chen accepted them with a deep bow, his face a mixture of shock and quiet joy. The other finalists gathered around him, offering congratulations. There was no resentment on their faces. They had heard him play, had felt what everyone else in the hall had felt. This wasn't just a competition victory. It was the recognition of something rare and precious. In the audience, Chen's parents stood holding each other, tears streaming down their faces. Around them, strangers patted their backs and shook their hands, as if some of Chen's achievement belonged to everyone who had witnessed it. Eleanor watched from her place at the judges' table, her heart full. There was something deeply satisfying about this moment, about seeing genuine talent recognized, about being part of that recognition. She thought about her students at the conservatory, about how she might bring some of what she had learned these past 2 days into her teaching. After the ceremony concluded and the audience began to disperse, a small reception was held in the lobby for the finalists and their families. Crystal punch bowls sat on white-clothed tables alongside trays of small sandwiches and cookies. Judges, competitors, and parents mingled, discussing performances and future plans. Eleanor made her way through the crowd to where Chen stood with his parents. He was holding a plate with a single cookie on it, looking slightly overwhelmed by all the attention. People kept coming up to congratulate him, asking for his autograph, inquiring about his teacher in Nebraska. "Congratulations, Chen," Eleanor said when she reached him. "Your performances were truly remarkable." "Thank you, ma'am," he replied, his voice soft but steady. His mother, Grace, beamed at Eleanor. "We still can't believe it. When Mrs. Huang suggested he enter this competition, we thought it would just be a good experience for him, a chance to play on a real concert grand. We never expected—" She gestured around at a loss for words. "Where is Mrs. Huang?" Eleanor asked, curious to meet the teacher who had guided this extraordinary talent. "She couldn't make the trip," Tom explained. "She's 82 and travel is difficult for her now. But she'll be thrilled when we call her with the news." Eleanor nodded, imagining the elderly piano teacher in her living room in Millfield, Nebraska, waiting by the phone for news of her student's performance. "Chen," she said, turning to the boy, "I'd like to ask you something. What are your plans for your musical education going forward?" Chen looked at his parents uncertainly. "We haven't really thought that far ahead," Grace admitted. "Music lessons are expensive and Millfield doesn't have many opportunities. Mrs. Huang has been teaching him for free, but she's getting older." Eleanor had suspected as much. "I teach at the New England Conservatory," she said. "We have a pre-college program for exceptional young musicians. Based on what I've heard these past 2 days, I believe Chen would be an ideal candidate." Chen's eyes widened. His father looked stunned, but "We could never afford that," Tom said quietly. "And we live in Nebraska." Eleanor had anticipated this response. "There are scholarships available, full scholarships for students of Chen's caliber, and there are housing options as well. Host families who provide room and board for young musicians from out of state." She watched as the implications of her words sank in. Chen looked from her to his parents, his expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "It would mean moving to Boston at least during the school year," Eleanor continued. "It's a big decision, but it would give Chen access to teachers, to performance opportunities, to a community of other young musicians." "Could I still see my parents?" Chen asked, his voice small but clear. Eleanor smiled. "Of course. There are school vacations and your parents could visit. It's not an easy arrangement, but many families make it work for the sake of nurturing exceptional talent." Grace and Tom exchanged a look, one of those silent conversations that parents have when faced with a decision that could change their child's life. "Would I get to play on a good piano every day?" Chen asked, and Eleanor's heart tightened at the simple question. She thought of the dozens of Steinway grands at the conservatory, of practice rooms available 16 hours a day, of the many things this talented boy had been doing without. "Yes," she said. "You would have access to excellent instruments whenever you wanted to practice." Something settled in Chen's expression. He looked at his parents. "I want to try," he said simply. Grace touched her son's hair gently. "We'll need to think about it. Talk to Mrs. Huang. This is a big decision." "Of course," Eleanor said. "There's no rush. The next pre-college auditions aren't until spring." She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "Please call me when you're ready to discuss it further. And regardless of what you decide about the conservatory, I'd be happy to work with Chen whenever you're in Boston." Tom took the card carefully, as if it were something fragile and precious. "Thank you, Professor Wright. This means a lot." Eleanor nodded, understanding all that went unsaid. The sacrifices they had already made for their son's gift. The bigger ones they might need to make in the future. The mixture of pride and fear that came with watching a child's talent create opportunities that would inevitably lead them away from home. "I should let you enjoy the reception," she said. "But before I go, Chen, I wanted to ask, what was it like for you playing the Goldberg variations yesterday? How did it feel?" Chen considered the question with the same seriousness he brought to everything. "It felt like I was inside the music," he said finally. like I wasn't playing it. I was just letting it come out. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense to Eleanor. It was exactly what the greatest musicians experienced, that transcendent state where the boundary between performer and music dissolved, where technique became transparent and only the pure communication remained. Yes, she said softly. That makes perfect sense. Chen smiled then, a real smile that transformed his serious face into that of a regular 12-year-old boy. It was fun too, he added, especially when everybody clapped so loud at the end. Eleanor laughed, charmed by this reminder of his youth. For all his musical maturity, he was still a child, still capable of taking simple pleasure in applause and cookies, and the possibility of playing on good pianos. Well, you deserved every bit of that applause, she said, and I think you'll be hearing a lot more of it in the years to come. As she walked away, leaving the family to celebrate together, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. Teaching had become routine for her in recent years, a job rather than a calling. But these past 2 days had rekindled something essential, a reminder of why music mattered, of the transformative power it held. Chen Li from Millfield, Nebraska, with his second-hand suit and his extraordinary gift, had changed her as surely as she might now change his life. It was a fair exchange, she thought, one that spoke to the heart of what music was all about. Not competition, not technical perfection, but connection. One human soul reaching out to others through the language of sound. Outside, the night was clear and cool. Stars sparkled above the Boston skyline. Eleanor paused on the steps of the concert hall, listening to the fading sounds of celebration behind her. From inside, she could hear the delicate notes of a piano, someone playing a snippet of Bach, perhaps inspired by what they had heard. She smiled and began her walk home, humming softly to herself, already thinking about how her Monday morning piano class would be different, how she would try to help her students find what Chen had found, that magical space where music becomes more than notes on a page, more than a display of skill, more than a competition to be won. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest teaching happens when we ourselves are taught, and sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected sources.